Hi everyone, thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Cara Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And tonight I'm very excited to welcome John King for a celebration of his book, Portal. Let's give a hand for John. And John is joined tonight by Woody LaBounty. Let's give a hand for Woody as well. This is a very San Francisco night in a very San Francisco institution about a very San Francisco book, and not just about the Ferry building, I've been told. So we're going to hear a little bit, and I'm very excited about it. I have a little bit of business before I get to the fun part of the evening. I'll let these two take it away. Brief business. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones. If you have not already, please do that. I would say picture taking is okay, encouraged even. But yeah, don't take a call in the middle of the event. That's not cool. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are currently attending. So if you are interested in things like this, please do check out what else we have to offer in the coming season. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. And if you need to know where it is, please ask me and I will gladly tell you. We have plenty of copies of Portal at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, including John King here this evening.
And I will sign.
And he'll sign them, which is like great. Oh my goodness. He might even make it out to you personally if you ask politely. So we always appreciate it if you're able. Thank you so much. And without further ado, okay, I printed out the bios for different authors who are not the two people who are sitting in front of me now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is instead I'm going to let these two take it away and let them talk a little bit more about their work and about the book. We're going to hear a little bit of an excerpt from the book from John. John and Woody are going to talk, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A at the end. So sorry about that, but I think they can talk about this far better than I could anyway. So let's give one more hand for John King and Woody LaBounty.
And just to keep things straight, which you already know, I'm John King. I'm the urban design critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. My master's thesis was on Herb Caen, and I got to go to France with Willie Brown when I was at City Hall. And Woody LaBounty is the All Things Western Neighborhood Project, now SF Heritage, and author of a book on Carville by the Sea, my favorite sunset trivia, and Ingleside Terrace.
Yeah.
So we're all set.
I didn't bring those tonight, so don't ask for them.
And I want to start with a very brief reading before going into the conversation that is not one I've done before, and the Ferry building only makes a cameo appearance, but I chose this one because I think it conveys a little bit of what I tried to do with this book, which was to write a history of the Ferry building, kind of an architectural history, lots of urban history. Back more?
Sorry, John, I got you. But keep talking.
I thought it was sprouting tinnitus or whatever it is. So on the one hand, wanting to tell a history of the building, but also use the building to tell a much larger set of histories about San Francisco and the Bay Area. Certainly since the Ferry building opened in 1898, and really going back before that. So this starts in basically sometime in the 60s or early 70s. And I'll let you guess what the prior chapter is about by the first paragraph that I read. Whether you loved it or hated it but loved the concrete behemoth's enticing ease, the Embarcadero Freeway offered a stunning ride on its upper deck. Coming from North Beach, the journey began with a propulsive upward curve from Broadway that swung to the right as it gained elevation and showcased the Bay Bridge in its metallic stride across the open water. The view into the city was both dramatic and daunting, a bulky clod of towers that thickened year after year, all of them lacking the chiseled romance that emanated from the terracotta-clad skyline the slabs had engulfed. They also blocked Twin Peaks and other hills that gave San Francisco a look like no other American metropolis. Construction cranes came and went, adding to the layered wall of rectangular forms that from some angles evoked bundled stacks of computer cards. The view on the left toward the bay, same as it ever was. The 1960s and 70s passed with no obvious change at all. You could barely see the graying piers below, where fewer and fewer ships pulled in or sailed out. The ferry building clock tower, at least, still had gravitas. But if traffic stopped moving and there was time for a close look, the driver would realize that the landmark had seen much better days. The dignified old friend looked faded, in need of new paint, and the driver might wonder if big new buildings like the ones to the right would soon begin to line the bay as well. Fair question, because the freeway's upper deck placed you in the middle of San Francisco's ongoing struggle over the kind of city that it wanted to be. Amid this upheaval was the enduring presence of the ferry building, a steadying force in some ways, a statuesque rebuke in others. The generational shifts that had made it superfluous, such as the triumph of automobiles embodied by the Embarcadero Freeway, helped in an odd way to amplify its cultural importance. With a powerful waterfront setting and tall corporate intruders kept at figurative bay by the ungainly viaduct, the ferry building stood apart. Isolation could be read as something like defiance. Okay.
I love that. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, John, for writing this book. I told John this before, but after I read it, I was thinking, what I admired most about this book was, as a history person myself, and a person who writes about history, it had what I kind of think of as the 3 E's that make a great history book. It's educational, but it's also entertaining, and it's efficient. Because I can tell you, if you start getting into anything in the past, you could just write tons and tons of, you just get into everything. But John basically covers not just the history of the ferry building, but basically the history of San Francisco since its construction in a very efficient and entertaining and educational way. So it was just kind of a great experience to read it, and I read it like in 2 days. So real quick, I just want to read one little tiny sentence you put in here because I think it's a good way to kick this off. You wrote, "Every city has a landmark like this, a building through which one can read the larger history." So that's kind of a good way to kick this off. Is like, why did you write a book about the ferry building, and what is the larger history it's sort of saying about San Francisco?
I think what the ferry building says about San Francisco is that it is a city that has been in really perpetual flux and change, certainly since gold was discovered, up in the Sierra. But beyond that, it's a building that I think certainly from the 1890s, has been pulled by 3 types of tension. One, very simple backdrop, I won't go into it, is all the larger changes in America. For instance, you needed a ferry building because you didn't have bridges and you didn't have cars, so you needed a ferry building to get into San Francisco. And then the other reason I think it works is that so much of San Francisco's change throughout its history has been cultural, and the rare magnetic force of this place for different social movements over time. And the ferry building hasn't been in the middle of all of those, but they've all bumped against it. So it became a way to write about, Woody's right. I as a working journalist, I pride myself on efficiency. And the kind of things I left out is in the early 70s, a terrorist group bombed the ferry building in reaction to the shooting of George Jackson, I believe in Soledad prison, maybe, yeah. And George Jackson was shot by guards, and this terrorist group sent out, called places saying, we're going to bomb state office buildings. And the federal building happened to have a Bureau of the State Department of Alcohol Licenses or something. So it's like, you know, the bombing did no damage. I ended up tossing it out because it didn't fit kind of the arc of that chapter where it would have popped in. But so many things brushed against it. But then I think the main thing and why the Ferry building works so powerfully is that San Francisco throughout its history has been pulled in these different directions. That it is a major American city, but it's also a California city that prides itself on its neighborhoods, on its working class past. On the intersect, it wants grand landmarks, but it wants preservation. It wants to preserve nature, but it also wants to totally reshape nature, as with the Embarcadero seawall. And the Ferry building, I wasn't setting out thinking, I want to write a book about San Francisco, what can I hang it on? The Ferry building, I've been at the Chronicle since the early 90s, but I became the architecture critic in 2001. And, you know, I wrote a review of the Ferry building when it reopened. And so it's so hard to do a book, as you know, but you know, the whole third section of the book, I was kind of reporting on the job. And what got me thinking in a book way was a year or two after a 2013 set of exhibitions I helped put together. Some of you might have gone to. It was called Unbuilt San Francisco. It was at the Historical Society. It was at the San Francisco Main Library. It was at Spur. It was at the American Institute of Architects. And looking at all these different unbuilt visions for the Ferry building and the Embarcadero that just accumulated, I got so fascinated at how this one thing never changed, but all the debates around it kept changing, and there were all these visions around it. And that, a year or two later, led to me thinking, there's a good book to be written on the Ferry building that is also a way of writing about how American cities changed in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this Ferry building, and I guess this is something that, you know, if you think of what's a landmark in San Francisco today, you know, I mean, I've got a tie with Coit Tower on it, but the Golden Gate Bridge and both bridges really, you know, these were all coming after. But when it was built, when it was constructed, when it was designed, it's a functional building that, you know, is a place to greet visitors, new arrivals, commuters, of course. In the design and in the sort of creation of it, how much of it was practical and how much of it was sort of aspirational?
Yeah, it was very aspirational. I mean, it was explicitly, I mean, this part isn't a quote from any government document, but this was the very explicit thing, which is, we want to build the equivalent of all those grand railroad depots in cities on the East Coast and in the heartland. We are going to show, because at the time, San Francisco, it was the 8th biggest city in the country. I mean, in terms of population. It was the biggest industrial port on the West Coast. I mean, this was an unabashed, we want to be a major big city. And part of that means you've got your grand civic building that welcomes people coming in. So that was from the start, but it was also very efficiently designed. When I do slideshows or PowerPoints on this, one thing I make a point of showing is, I have an aerial diagram, but I'm thinking of swapping an actual aerial photograph for it, is the building, the clock tower is a signal to the world, you are entering San Francisco. The arches at the foot of the arches facing west, it was explicitly placed there. This is the key location in San Francisco. It's where Market Street meets the water. So you've got these grand arches, this strong march. You know, if you actually look at the building, there aren't a lot of architectural frills and flourishes. If you go to the Ferry building and then you go to, say, Grand Central Station, it's a whole different realm of flourishes and things like that. because the Ferry building was a state building. It was a state-owned office building, or not an office building, but it was a state-owned property. The Port of San Francisco didn't become part of city government until the late 60s. But it was designed very efficiently where all the ferries, today we have the ferry boats pull in, you get off the ferry, you walk in, ideally you walk through the ferry building, but you can also just walk around or whatever. This thing, the ferries, some of the ferries were 2,500 seats. They pulled straight, the building was like an airport. It had, basically it had its kind of passenger gates coming out. So if you looked at it from above, it's like someone had pressed an iron into this big rectangle and cut out all these slits. And those were where the ferries pulled in, the front of the boat dropped down like a garage, and people walked straight out into the second floor of the ferry building. And so
they went into the second floor too. That's the other thing. Like if you go to the ferry building, you assume the passengers were all on the ground floor.
The ground floor was baggage area, it was storage, it was ticket counters, there was a post office, there were a few waiting rooms, but by all accounts, no one ever used them because it was so much cooler upstairs. So I mean, it's just, the building, and maybe we'll get to this later or whatever, but I mean, the building was really, the ferry building we have now was this wonderful restoration, but it was also an act of reinvention. Mm-hmm. Especially the ground floor shows it the most. I won't go into details, but it just was utter, let's make this building for the 21st century. Successfully, I'm not faulting it.
Right. And that is part of this book and this story is this sort of reinvention of a landmark that was neglected, forgotten, thought to be replaced a number of times, and then rediscovered and used for a new purpose, which is what's great about the great buildings, is that they can serve many different purposes, but they elevate whatever purpose does make use of them. And the ferry building's a great example of that. So let's just go a little, so we have this big statement to the world. San Francisco is a real city, a grand city, up there with New York and these big places. And when you experience the city, you actually experience it from the water mostly, which is, I think, something people don't do now, which is kind of interesting. And you come in and this was your gateway, your portal to San Francisco. So I think we can guess, but what changes to make the ferry building not the grand gateway and the portal into San Francisco?
I would ask you if you guys know, but you're a smart crowd. Yeah, it's obvious. The automobile was invented. The automobile was rolled out at mass scale by Henry Ford. Great anecdote in the book about that.
You have to buy it.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell it to you. But, and it's all because the editor said, I want a better ending for that chapter. So he pushed me a little more to find more details, and it was worth the trouble. But it's obvious, it's the automobile was invented, and then the automobile became what everybody wanted. It was a way to get from point A to point B without any problem. You didn't have to have a schedule. You could go whenever you wanted, wherever you wanted. You had car dealerships. You had car companies. I mean, there was a big lobbying organization from the 20s on that was all about we need to bridge the bay. And the rhetoric, full-page newspaper ads. The newspapers were complicit to the extent that every holiday week. So the ferry building was so efficient, but then with cars, you started getting these like kind of annexes with none of the grandeur. And, a Memorial Day weekend, say, you'd have cars 6 wide, a mile back on the Embarcadero to try and get into the car ferries to go back to the East Bay. Always a big story in the local newspaper on that. Because it was a way of saying, look, this is an obsolete thing. If we're going to be a big city, we need bridges coming in here. The bridges, the first section of the book's called Heyday, and the second section of the book's called Relic, because once the bridges went up, that's what it was.
Yeah. So you called in the book, the ferry building, you called it visual shorthand for one of the nation's most recognizable cities. So the cars come in, the automobiles, you have the bridges, And then our beloved Embarcadero Freeway comes in the 1950s. By the way, I loved the Embarcadero Freeway, but you have to remember that I grew up with the Embarcadero Freeway already there, and the ferry building was sort of this relic that was behind it. That was like, it didn't have any relation to the city almost to me. It was almost like over there. But the Embarcadero Freeway was amazing views, and then you'd come down on Broadway and you'd get to see the adult theaters, which was very exciting for a young boy. And also it was where in Streets of San Francisco they always catch the bad guy underneath the Embarcadero Freeway, by the way. So the freeway feels to me like the ultimate repudiation of the ferry building as some kind of symbol of San Francisco. It's hemmed in, it's separated, and then I couldn't believe in your book, and this goes back to your inspiration for Unbuilt San Francisco, some of the plans that were put out there to replace or change the way the ferry building was.
Yeah, I spend a decent amount of time in the book, and there are some illustrations in the book. There was and this was a state plan in the late 40s to tear down the ferry building and build a World Trade Center there that would involve, it would be a 9-block World Trade Center. Kind of like, gee, New York has Rockefeller Center, we'll do a World Trade Center. And it would have been 3 blocks on what existed at the time, basically walling off, covering the Embarcadero, things like that. And then 6 blocks of fill going into the bay. The ferry building would be torn down and be replaced by a 40-story, pure modern international style slab. And it would be flanked by all these like 8-story buildings. There was a mammoth fountain in a mammoth plaza that was a caricature of the bad architecture of that scale. And then there were grand steps leading up from the water into the plaza, though how anyone would get to the steps was kind of unexplained. And this was something the state proposed it, because again, the state owned the waterfront. The land was offered to the state by the city fathers, and everyone embraced the idea. The papers were for it. It wasn't even a big controversy. I found it wasn't written about that much. I found one supervisor who said tearing down the ferry building would be like tearing down the Eiffel Tower, and everybody just scoffed at him and said, oh, there's a great letter to the editor. You've got to move your calendar past 1905. It's 1948. It's like, okay. And the reason the plan died is that it made no financial sense. This is about 15 years, true. This is about 15 years before the World Trade Center in New York, which itself didn't make financial sense, the towers, just the amount of space. It was just this odd post-World War II idea that was pretty nebulous, that we're juggernauts of trade, we're going to need big buildings to house all the consulates and all the this and all the that, and so what ended up was half of the ferry building, the northern half, was converted in a very crude modern way into a World Trade Center, which that was the first step. And eventually the south end was used for port offices, and it also was really crudely renovated. But then beyond that, Larry Halprin, one of the best landscape architects and urban visionaries the Bay Area has produced. Once the freeway went up, it's how do we get people to the waterfront? So the idea was, we'll build a big waterfront park. So to do that, we'll keep the ferry building tower and we'll cut away the bases, the 2 sides, so people will see the water underneath the freeway and walk underneath to go to this. Historic ships were in vogue. These drawings always have a few, like kind of masted ships.
Clipper ships, yeah.
Clipper ships, just... Apparently there was a big storehouse of old clipper ships at the time. So there were that kind of plan. There was a U.S. Steel was going to build a 40-story tower just south of the ferry building, which was a huge battle in the late 60s, early 70s. This is like about the time the Transamerica Pyramid was going up, and a lot of old San Franciscans and young San Franciscans were just so upset at the pace of change. But the thing about the U.S. Steel Tower, and I don't have an image in the book, unfortunately, the runner-up was a Ford dealership that would be on fill, projecting into the water, and have like a 12,000 space parking garage that would be entered from the Embarcadero. So it'd be like you get a car dealership and a parking garage downtown.
On the water.
So, on the water. So it's like, okay, in context, the U.S. Steel project starts to look pretty good.
Yeah. You get a great view, buy a car, it's like a nice deal. Whenever you see those plans where you see the giant tower, you feel a lot better about today, I gotta say, because I'm reading The Power Broker about Robert Moses, which is, I don't know, if you're just feeling like in a really good mood and you want to be depressed for 3 months, you can read about Robert Moses and all the stuff he did in New York. But you see these drawings and these sketches, and you're just amazed at what could have been. And the Embarcadero Freeway starts looking a lot better, actually. But I feel like when the ferry stopped, right? Because we're talking about late 50s, right, when the last ferry happens. And then you talk about in here the very unsympathetic renovation to the inside, kind of making it look like drop ceiling offices, kind of pull everything together. It really feels like they didn't have a purpose for the building. And it was this icon. It had gone through the earthquake and fire of 1906. And everybody knew it from the old days, but it was this relic that they couldn't find a purpose for, right?
Yeah, really, from 1939 to 1989, the question was, what do we do with this thing? The only explicit proposal to tear it down was the World Trade. I mean, things came and went, but they were just kind of bizarre. But that was the only, I've got the little trade, the hardbound prospectus for it and things like that. But there was, what do you do with it? And every attempt to do something with it foundered on the fact it was so isolated from the everyday city. The last proposal was actually done by the office of I.M. Pei, no hack as an architect. And it was approved by the Port Commission in the early 80s. And it would involve kind of tearing down and rebuilding Pier 1. In part to hold parking for the redone ferry building. And when you look at it in hindsight, it was so a product of that era, you're very glad it didn't get built, even though it was a renovation. And I talked to one of the architects who was involved at the time on the Pei team, and he's like, what they told themselves at the time, because this is when preservation was just starting, how do we make this thing work? And to them it's like, we're going to get the building restored. The front facade is going to look as good as it did on opening day. And so they accepted the totally modern terraces stepping down to the water and things. But so it was the Embarcadero Freeway coming down that made people start realizing, this thing's only a walk away.
Enter our hero, the 1989 earthquake, right? This is the hero of this book. Terrible tragedy. However, that's what really spurred all of this, right? And because this freeway, Embarcadero Freeway, was really the log jam for any kind of reinvention of the ferry building. Who can we credit, other than the earthquake, for this sort of change and this new idea of how the ferry building could be used?
Yeah, there are lots of people to credit. Some who are still living, some who are still dead. But the politicians who are still dead,
I'm stealing that. I think that's great.
They are still dead. But the key political figure was Mayor Art Agnos, who was not a big environmentalist, and he is happy to admit that he was not interested in getting involved in it. And his staff certain members of his staff were really making the case, if you do this, you'll be remembered forever for taking down the Embarcadero Freeway and reopening the waterfront. And they had, and he just described, he'd be sitting in his office, you'd have Chinatown activists or North Beach activists making the case, don't get in the way of this, just fix fix the Embarcadero Freeway, that's how people get here from the south and from the east. They'd leave the office, 10 minutes later, in would come environmental activists, transportation activists, with mayoral planners, like Dean Macris, who was the planning director, was a big fan of that. And they would say, this is your chance to reshape the Northeast city from here on. And so he came around, and he lost, and it was a 6-5 vote at the Board of Supervisors. It was that close to not being torn down. Trivia note, some of you look like you've been around a little while. You may or may not remember in 1986, I think, Dianne Feinstein, who was, she hated the freeway. She got a measure on the ballot to tear down the freeway, and it was resoundingly defeated. It lost by like 60%. You know, so Art Agnos he had no interest in reopening that battle with everything else he was dealing with after the earthquake. But he did, got it through the board by a 6-5 vote, and he narrowly lost the mayor's election. And he insists now that that's the reason, is because of the shift in votes in North Beach, Chinatown, Telegraph Hill. And, you know, but he's very happy with it because it is his legacy.
I'm always think it's ironic that Rose Pack has her name on a transit station because she was fighting tooth and nail to keep that freeway up. But I guess two things can be true. Okay, Embarcadero Freeway comes down. Now we have suddenly we can see the Ferry building. Suddenly it's connected to downtown and the Grand Boulevard of Market Street. And how does the vision that we think of now at the Ferry building come about with the farmers market and it being sort of a foodie paradise? How does that kind of come together?
Well, in a way, what it is that it signaled the Ferry building that reopened in 2003 was so in tune with a particular facet of the Bay Area at that moment. And it was very much this artisanal, local, regional, authentic, foodie mecca, all these things that were so much part of the post-60s adult culture of the Bay Area, and particularly San Francisco and the Inner Bay Area, manifested itself in the building. That was kind of the explicit idea of the developer. It wasn't like, oh, maybe we can put some of the local food stuff in and make people happy. It was really, we need to bring that whole segment of the Bay Area into our store. We need Alice Waters' blessing. We need this. We need that.
It still doesn't seem like a gimme. Like nowadays we have a farmer's market in every alleyway. But back then, you know, this was a new idea, right?
Back then it was, thanks for bringing me back to that. I mean, the farmer's market, that was kind of a one-off that was done. It was intended as a one-off to say, we need a farmer's market downtown. You've got Allegheny. I think that the Civic Center had started by then, heart of the city. But it was, you know, that's, you know, this is when you didn't even have, back then you barely had the idea of crossing Market Street for a lot of San Franciscans. So much less the idea of going to the Tenderloin. But it was like, it caught on so much so quickly that it became a fixture, you know, like underneath the freeway. And then not underneath the freeway, that was gone. But in the old parking lots that were still parking lots. It was like no parking on Saturday in all these metered parking lots that used to be shadowed by the freeway. And then when the work was done, it moved up to Broadway or just north of Broadway. And then it moved back down. And, you know, and now it really is inseparable. And everybody, I talked to someone involved with the farmers market at the Ferry building who rolled their eyes not totally happily at the East Cut Benefit District or whatever it's called.
Rincon Hill.
That Trans Bay area.
Yeah.
But their branding is sticking edge. That's anyway. I'm not very powerful at all in this city. I certainly don't determine neighborhood names. But the point of this was they were really working hard to get a farmer's market in the East Cut because that shows we're a real neighborhood.
Right. You've graduated.
You got one 3 days a week, one block, so.
Yeah. Well, and there's the backlash. You talk about that in the book too. It starts becoming like, is this an elitist exercise and all that? And we can talk more about that, but I do want to leave time for questions for the audience. But before we get there, I want to read another little part, kind of near the end, probably the very end of the book, John, that I thought was really some great writing. Just a quick paragraph.
Sure.
You say, ultimately, or you're right, ultimately there is no single ferry building. That has always been the case, which is why it has survived. If the structure that opened in 1898 had only been the world's second busiest transportation depot, or the tallest building on the waterfront, or a place to show guests from out of town, it would have become another old building that architecture buffs adore and the rest of us don't think much about. Another structure that had its moment and then the moment was gone. What makes the Ferry building and similar landmarks into icons, however you define that nebulous word, is that they stay lodged in public consciousness, take on new personas as the worlds around them change. They always have something to contribute to the discussion of what makes a city vital at this point in time. So it's changed. What does the Ferry building say about our city at this point in time?
At this point in time, it shows the wrestling match in San Francisco between, you can say, the haves and the have-nots, or you can say the strike. Basically the whole question of diversity. The current operators of the Ferry building, you can question various proposals they have, but they genuinely kind of figure, okay, we need to represent more than the Chez Panisse orbit here. And so there's this real effort. How is San Francisco defined in 2024? It's a neighborhood city. So you've got the bagel maker from Dog Patch. You've got Reams from the Mission. They're really consciously, Red Bay Coffee is from Oakland, really consciously trying to bring in things that's like, this is a diverse group of neighborhood-type merchants who have bubbled up and now they're getting the prime slot. And then the other thing, and then the whole issue of access, but that gets more fine-grained. But then the other thing is sea level rise. I did a big story last week, the basics are in the book, but the plans keep changing or moving forward. And the whole question of the expectation of the port and the Army Corps of Engineers, which manages the thing, is we're going to need to raise the Ferry building and the seawall. The seawall to keep the inland financial district and neighborhoods from being flooded, obviously. Ferry building, because we cannot lose the Ferry building. It is too important a symbol of San Francisco to just let it go. And I can get into that in more detail in questions, but this incredible dilemma where it's like, it's very fraught in terms of engineering, the cost would be astounding. Surprise, surprise, the developer with the 66-year lease is saying, we don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah,
and we have 60 tenants inside.
Yeah.
So it's just like, what do you do? So, it's very much, it is a building where the struggles and questions of the moment for San Francisco are actively debated.
And, in this whole, it's such a visible part. It's in all the guidebooks. You visit, Prince Charles visits, he went to the Ferry building. A president visits, they walk around the Ferry building. It's like a big tourist attraction. It's a thing to do here. So with the sort of general reputation of San Francisco on the ropes and struggling, especially its downtown, is the Ferry building kind of holding up its end?
It is. If you go to the Ferry building on a Saturday, it could be 2019. And if you go to it on a weekday, there are fewer people because there aren't all the workers nearby coming over for lunch and things. But the farmer's market is still Tuesdays and Thursdays. Almost every stall inside is now full. The two big unleased spaces are two very big ones. It's the slanted door space. The slanted door officially said we're not coming back.
Yeah.
And then Market Bar, whatever, the big one on the southwest corner, that had pretty much announced plans to close before the pandemic, and it followed through on those plans. So you got these two kind of anchor spaces that are empty. So there's obviously that question, but it feels healthy. It is not like walking down Powell Street or on Sutter Street or something. Worlds removed from that.
Yeah, so it's a testimony essentially to the plan and
the city.
and the way it came. So, well, John, thank you so much for writing this book. And I do want to emphasize it's not just about the Ferry building. It really is sort of a great run through the city's history and all the things it's gone through in the past.
Lawrence Ferlinghetti makes several cameo appearances.
Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
Hate to mention arrival of Green Apple.
Right.
It's great to be back in live video, by the way. So it's a terrific book just to learn more about the city you're living in. So it's a great way to do it. Can we have some questions from the audience? Does anybody have a question for John or on this topic? Yes, Karen.
So I don't.
And I'll repeat the questions. For folks.
Okay. I don't think I saw. I mean, I saw from the outside the original Ferry building, but I don't think I was inside it very much. So before the renovation, were there large, tall ceilings and waiting rooms or something?
So the question is,
what was it like? Before
the early 2000s renovation, what would the interior of the Ferry building have looked like?
Basically, the north half in the 50s, the south half in the 60s. The big space in the middle was filled in. They just built across the nave. The nave is the skylit space. They just filled in floors between them, built out basically just took the upper floors and turned it into straight office space with drop ceilings, new concrete structural walls spanning where is now the skylight. So the whole building had to essentially be gutted. All the tiles were taken out and put back, for instance. And then the ground floor on the north side was
so there were offices in there before?
There were offices. They basically...
Yeah, the south half was a state office building and lawyers and things like that. There was no retail.
Okay.
And then the north half was lots of small import-export wholesalers. There were like telecommuting startups there. I've talked to people who worked for little startups in the 80s.
Yeah, it was cheap office space.
It was cheap office space.
So there weren't gorgeous
with great
waiting.
views.
There weren't gorgeous waiting rooms.
No, they were all torn out. They were all torn out. They were all torn out in the 50s.
That's what I'm talking about. Is the original?
Yeah, it was all gone.
Yeah, so
but they used to have
the original waiting rooms for the
That's
ferry.
what I'm asking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original. The basic form. It was restored to what it is now from the second floor up. But the nave was fully filled. There weren't the two big holes cut into it, and then the side facing the water was waiting rooms. Very nice waiting rooms, sun dappled and everything. And then there was, I think, a state museum, like the Gems and Precious Stones Museum. And there were several state agencies. So essentially, the ground floor was functional space, and then the top two floors were state office space and waiting rooms.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions about anything? We can answer any question. Yes.
It's interesting that you mentioned, and I'll look forward to reading it in the book, but that it was envisioned as the Grand Central Station of the West originally, and the welcoming gate for San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think? Certainly there's vision for more transportation on the water, both sort of mass transportation, like more ferries, electric ferries, very exciting, as well as other kinds of smaller transportation. So will it be, I know we have Trans Bay as a competitor for Grand Central of the West, but do you think there's potential?
Let me repeat it for the online folks who may not hear that. The question was, since the Ferry building was originally created as sort of a Grand Central Station transportation hub for the city, is there a chance that that sort of use could come back, not just for ferries, but for other forms of transportation at the ferry building?
I don't think so, because it's now kind of a freestanding building on the water. You know, again, like the ferry gate, the ferry gates are all out there. And without a lot of success, though it does exist, there's the effort to get the water taxis going, you know, things like that. So it would never become a necessity. You know, the hope is that the Trans-Bay Transit Center will become a necessity with this high-speed rail coming up and commuter rail coming up, you know. So I certainly hope that happens. But that's designed as more of an integral piece of the transportation network. This is more a way to celebrate the return of traveling on the water.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, did the port send out proposals to rehab the ferry building? And one of the proposals was to turn it into a foodie place, and that's the one that won. Because whose idea was it to make it a foodie place?
So, did the port put out proposals to reimagine the ferry building into what it is today, or how did that plan sort of come together? Whose idea was it?
It was a request for proposals from developers, and they were pretty. The port's rules, so to speak, were pretty explicit, which was, we want this wonderful civic treasure restored, and we want it to become a public, functioning retail building on the ground floor. And we want it to generate money for the Port of San Francisco. So everyone had variations of, and we're going to have a lot of food stuff there. The IM Pay plan had something like that was totally ridiculous, but it was like, we're going to have a Viennese cafe 24 hours a day at the south end, and we're going to have a fern bar at the north end. You know, it was the era. We'll just put it that way. But
I like fern bars.
But this was very the team that won, and so everyone had lots of office space up high. The team that won was explicitly, we're going to tie into local food people. They didn't have explicit commitments, but very much this is the ethos that we want to show off, rather than just there'll be a mixed use of this, that, and the other thing. And then they were the only developer that proposed fully reopening the nave and restoring the skylights. Everyone else kept chunks of it because it meant more leasable square footage.
Because it feels like they were really very successful. There have been so many developers taking on structures in the city that went nowhere. You know, so
They did.
So I feel like they really did a great job of implementing what they said they would.
This was a case where the request for proposals, they hit the home run.
Yes.
That's what you're saying. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question from our online audience.
Oh, a question from the online audience.
I have a couple of comments that I will tell you after.
How many people are online?
About 25.
25. Welcome.
So Junior asks, what goes on upstairs at the Ferry building now?
The question is, what goes on upstairs at the ferry building now?
Upstairs, you've got the central nave, which only the central part of the central nave is public access. And there are now tables up there, by the way, where you can eat food. So if you go to the farmer's market, or you grab a lunch, grab a sandwich or something, you can go up there and sit on some communal tables and eat. But so the upper two floors are office space. Google is a tenant. There is some big hedge fund I don't know about. Those names don't, I'm not a business reporter. Those names don't stick. There's something called Shack 15 that's like a kind of a tech-oriented, entrepreneurial, open-oriented entrepreneurial space, co-working type of thing. So it's very much private office buildings, and one hearing room that is where the Port of San Francisco conducts its hearings. That was in the request for proposals. We want one space like that.
They have a great view.
They have a great view. Yes. I did an event there. Actually, it was your event, SF Heritage, and it's like, why listen to me when you can look outside?
We weren't. We were looking out the window. Yeah. No.
And then there are also events and other community meetings in there.
The port of San Francisco has offices there too, right?
No, they're in Pier 1.
Oh, they're in Pier 1 now. Okay. Great.
Oh, quick trivia. Before the restoration, the ground floor of the Ferry building on the south side included a parking lot, included parking for port maintenance vehicles.
Inside the building.
Inside the building. The ground floor was like a big garage.
Cool. We already got one, Carol. Go ahead.
Well, when you come around.
There's one back.
Why don't you go
Oh,
ahead? Yeah.
So, I love that area. Ever since I moved to San Francisco, I gravitated. I remember when the farmer's market was across the street and outside, and I was thrilled that they used the Ferry building for that. But why? There seem to be so many aspirational structures around that area. The Embarcadero
The
structures
bow and arrow.
don't seem to be used as much. Why haven't people worked hard at bringing that foot traffic in between those two and connecting those? Also, I went to something, and I can't even remember which pier it was on, but Mayor Breed had her State of the City speech on one of the big piers.
70.
I didn't even know it was there. It's like a convention space, and a couple of weeks later, I was invited to something at some international blah blah blah. I don't know. Excuse me. Somebody who's probably the head of it is here, but
So you're trying to wonder why the other port buildings and the piers and the bulkheads aren't
couldn't
integrated
something more
with
be
the.
done about tying in all these spaces that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, if you kind of restated the question, like, can more be done? It's very expensive, and there has to be a reason for something to exist. Like the Pier 70 project you're talking about with that big shed that was elevated, which is strange, and because of sea level rise, but it's a light metal building from World War II. It's not the Ferry building. That was going great guns until the pandemic. There's housing approved there, all sorts of stuff, more offices. That building was going to be the artisanal center, and the expectation was Google would lease a lot of space and really be the engine to get it going. And then the pandemic came, and it's in this weird state of suspended animation. And then, proposals always come and go on the pier, the historic finger piers, where developers come in with great ideas, they keep pushing the great ideas, and then finally they just run the numbers one last time and say, wow, that's a lot of money, $150 million. I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's slowly but surely.
There was a question in the back, and we'll make that our last question for tonight. But you're all who are here can talk with John after. I'm sure he has more to share. Bob? I know everybody in this audience.
Mine are, I guess, comments that aren't maybe questions. I seem to remember Herb Cain constantly railing against the Embarcadero Freeway. And you haven't mentioned that. I don't know whether, how important was Herb Cain in determining...
You have to buy the book. No, and the reason I say that...
the question was, the audience member remembers Herb Cain, particularly the columnist, longtime newspaper columnist, particularly railing against the Embarcadero Freeway.
Herb Cain became a major character in the book, which I did not expect. But it's just, he wrote about the city 6 days a week from the late 30s until the mid-1990s. The election I mentioned about where Dianne Feinstein led the push to tear down the freeway, and it went to the ballot, Herb Cain was against it. He said, keep the freeway. There was such fear of change and overdevelopment in the 80s and so much distrust in the basic capability of the San Francisco city government. Herb Cain said, I feel sheepish saying this, but better than evil we know than the evil we don't know.
Yeah.
So it was a surprise.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but and I've been planning to get your book ever since it came out.
He's a big character.
Now I will.
Yay.
My other comment and question is that my version of the 1991 mayoral election is that Art Agnos, the former social worker, lost because he would not clear the homeless encampment out of the Civic Center, and Frank Jordan, the former police chief, said he would do it.
Oh, I think you can totally make that case. I mean, Agnos alienated a lot of people. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it was just that it was a comment that Art Agnos may have lost that election because of homelessness in the Civic Center, and his opponent basically.
Yeah, there were definitely a lot of factors. I was giving you Art Agnos's position, and I'm not saying that was or wasn't it. It is, though, true looking at the precinct figures, the percentage of votes he got in North Beach, Telegraph Hill, Chinatown were much less than in '87, and much more of a drop percentage-wise than drops in other neighborhoods. So it's whether or not he's right, because I was living here at the time, there were definitely a lot of issues kicking around. Whether or not he was right, it's an argument you can make with a straight face.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, John, for being here and answering all.
Thank you, Woody. I will be signing books wherever they do that. And thank you all for coming out on a weeknight.
Yeah,
A place like this is such a resource and treasure to
support Green Apple Books. Come in, buy a book, and tune in for the next show, I guess. Thank you.
Can we give one more hand for John King and Willie? Thanks to you both. I am just here to say, one, I'm full of gratitude for both of you. Thank you so much. This is educational, entertaining. What was the third? Efficient. I'm just here to say that we have copies of Portal at the front register. You can find them there. And John is going to be signing at the back desk here, where my colleague Brendan is waiting. My illustrious colleague, Brendan. Correct. So books at the front. Come back here, we'll have a signing line. It'll make itself apparent. Please take a look around. We're open till 9. Make yourselves comfortable, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
See you at Little Shamrock later.